Hello, everyone. I am Gavin Kostick, the literary manager with Fishamble, the new play company. And if you are watching this, one hopes that you have seen, either live or through a streamed version, Fishamble's production of The Treaty by Colin Murphy, which deals with the signing of the Anglo-Irish Treaty 100 years ago to the week of production. Today, we have for you a post-show, as it were, discussion with Colin Murphy, the playwright, and Liz Gillis, a historian, who I will introduce properly in a few moments. Where we are right now is on the day of the first preview. So as we speak, the show is going to go into previews. So we don't know how it's going to turn out, but we look forward to it. But I will read you the list of the people who are involved in making this show happen. So as well as Fishamble's work could only exist with the support of the Arts Council, and we are absolutely grateful for our ongoing relationship with Dublin City Council to make this show happen. This was a co-commission by Fishamble and the Pavilion Theatre. It is part of the Department of Tourism's Culture, Arts, Celtic, Sport and Media's Decade of Centenaries programme. The production is supported by Culture Ireland, the National Concert Hall, the Irish Embassy in London, the Department of Tourism, Culture, Arts, Celtic, Sport and Media, Department of Foreign Affairs, and the British Irish Chamber of Commerce. So that gives you some sense of the energy and interest amongst Irish organisations about this document that still resonates this day. And I wonder, Colin, if I can come in there that way with you, it's given that lineup the sense that this is something that the nation at all different kinds of levels wants to look at. What were your first thoughts when being asked could you write a play on the treaty? What were your first thoughts when you given that commission?
Yeah, I suppose they certainly weren't about who the kind of partners and institutions and that kind of that sense of formal institutional embracing of it. They weren't about that at all. I suppose they were about, in the first place, the story. We've just done Inside the GPO. One's mind immediately turns to what's next. Is there a sequel? The great thing about writing history plays is there's always a sequel. And I became aware through Pádraig Dempsey of the Royal Irish Academy of the existence of the diaries of Tom Jones, who was Lloyd George's close advisor and confidant, and left us these published in the 60s, these diaries which sort of by the standards of exposés of politics today are extraordinarily intimate and detailed and revealing. And he diaried the whole treaty negotiations process. And I had a sense that unlike, when we think of this, the revolutionary period, the name we give to it is very leading. We think of the revolutions. We think of the Easter Rising, the War of Independence, the tragedy of the Civil War. But that crucial interregnum of talk in late 21, which consisted of the treaty negotiations, really dating from sort of the truce talks through to the signing of the treaty and then the treaty debates, is a little orphaned in the sort of folk memory. And of course, kind of what I do is I look for moments in Irish political history of really important arguments on which Irish history turns. And they're the things I've looked to bring to the stage: the bank guarantee, the bailout, the Gregory deal. And so the treaty negotiations really seem to me to be something that had been in the folk memory. I mean, not by historians, but in the folk memory, a little neglected or forgotten. There was the opportunity of very rich source material. And it also just seemed to fit really closely with the kind of work I like doing, the behind closed doors, corridors of power, reimagining of what compromises and bitter rivalries and friendships and conflict is happening between politicians to produce decisions on which history will turn.
Fantastic. In fact, you know what, Liz? I'll bring you in straight away on that. So I just want to make sure you're properly introduced, just to get this right. So this is historian and author Liz Gillis. She is from the Liberties and is the historian in residence for Dublin South County Council for the Decade of Centenaries. She's the author of 6 books about the Irish Revolution, including Women of the Irish Revolution and The Hales Brothers and the Irish Revolution. Liz has worked as a researcher on numerous publications, television, radio documentaries covering the period, and she is a researcher for the History Show on RTE Radio. In 2018, Liz was a recipient of the Lord Mayor's Award for her contribution to history. She was also the co-organiser of the annual conference on the burning of the Custom House in May 1921. And I'm smiling slightly because I'm about to throw a historian's question at you, and I hope you answer because it isn't what I planned. I just wonder, can you remember the first time you read the treaty, as a document? And really, have you looked at it, and what stood out for you as in actually what's in that document?
Oh God, it was years ago. It was actually, I'd foreseen the treaty drama. That's actually what piqued my interest, because I was really interested in the Civil War, but didn't sort of know how the Civil War came about. And then this drama was produced, the treaty, for the 75th anniversary, based on the actual documents of the time. And that really made it accessible, because when you see the treaty, it's a lot of words. It's there's all this, jargon and so on. But yeah, looking into it then, it is a fascinating document, because although it pertains to Ireland, it also has a legacy, to other countries as well. So I've gone back to it over the years. I haven't actually sat down and read it, cover to cover. I think a lot of people are like that. We know of the treaty, we know the bare bones of the treaty, what it meant. And of course, 2 big things were the oaths and finance and so on. And of course, then we have the boundary commission and so on. But yeah, it's a document that you necessarily wouldn't go to, your first port of call to go, oh yeah, let's get excited about this. However, with productions like what we're talking about, that is what is brilliant, because it's making it accessible to the people who will maybe see this play and then go back and look and read and want to know more about the intricacies of it and the negotiations behind it, how it actually came about, because that's the journey I made towards actually reading the document itself. It wasn't
Yeah. Can I poke you a bit on the two-sided nature of the treaty? Because we in Ireland naturally have a focus on the consequences of this in Ireland, but there is a consequence on the British side. So in signing a thing that said that part of Ireland becomes a free state, what were the consequences of that on the British side as it rolled out into the future?
Well, this is the thing. We all think about that Ireland, basically we don't get the idealised republic. But what we have to remember is Britain had a lot more to lose in this, because it's not just about Ireland, it's about the empire. And we look at the world today where our levels of communication and how information is just sent immediately across the world. And we don't think in those terms back 100 years ago, but it was like, all eyes were on Ireland. You have newspapers in India, across the empire, reporting on what was happening in Ireland. These are all colonies of the empire, and they're looking to see, what does Ireland get? If Ireland gets something, we can get something. And the British government is always aware of that. That is always in the back of their mind, because if one dominion goes, the rest are going to follow. It will be a domino effect. And that is what happens over the next 40, 50, 60 years. So what is signed in London in the early hours of the morning of the 6th of December has huge repercussions across the British Empire, because literally we say that, the sun set on the British Empire when the truce was called. It's actually when that document is signed, because elements of the arguments that come after the signing of the Anglo-Irish Treaty back home, as in De Valera's document number 2, External Association, that's applied to India in the 1940s. Couldn't be applied in 1921 with Ireland, but the British government then used that when they're dealing with India and their case for independence. And then, of course, we see the exact same thing happens, partition and so on across the empire as it goes.
Fantastic. And I'll keep knocking the ball about a bit. So if I come back your way in the sense with that, Colin, you've talked very interestingly in the past about how your own views not only are you looking to sort of elbow people who are watching it who have fixed and strong views about things, and the change that people might have in watching the thing, which might be uncomfortable, beliefs they had before seeing it, but how your own views sometimes have changed. In writing this particular one, in terms of like just stepping back a bit, I think people would reasonably think, oh, well, they went over to negotiate a republic. They didn't get a republic. In that sense, the Irish team did not deliver on the republic. Looking at it more closely, do you think a republic was over the table? Was that ever serious? Do you feel they went into a good faith? Do you feel they did the best? Or do you feel your views on what was achievable and have shifted since the making of the show, and what you now think about what was achieved?
I think I probably would have always been very skeptical about the De Valera line. I would have been kind of instinctively, reflexively pro-treaty, in the sense that I've never been a supporter of the idea that a particular interpretation of Irish freedom is something that needs to be killed for. So I would have felt that I would have always felt that the treaty was an honourable compromise, and therefore, whatever about its failings, it was not worth risking more death to improve upon it. So that would have been kind of my baseline, and in a similar sense, I would have had some skepticism about the Easter Rising when I went into inside the GPO, and I did find myself across that play becoming more sympathetic to the leaders of the Rising, and in this as well, I think Dev made bad calls at the time, but I think you have to acknowledge that, as Liz has said, he was ahead of his time, and the solution he was proposing was one that, from 1926, the British start effectively implementing through the empire, in terms of recalibrating the relationship with the dominions and bringing them up to a level of equality with Britain that's much closer to what Dev was talking about at the time. So, I feel I'd be more inclined to view him now as having acted in good faith, as having made mistakes in good faith at the time of the treaty. But the other thing is the other thing that sort of I think I feel a bit more deeply now is really the impossibility of attaining Irish unity at the time. The rhetorical claim on 32 county unity, I think, was a real poisoned chalice to send the delegates over seeking that, and it's pretty clear that De Valera and the rest of the leadership, even the anti-treaty leadership, largely accepted that unity was impossible without persuading unionism, and that was never admitted publicly, properly. There was never an attempt, as far as I can see, to have a proper national public conversation about that. And through reading, I'm looking to bring in the pro and anti-treaty side into this, but also the British imperial side and also the unionist side, and reading around unionist thinking at the time. I think I feel I understand how and why they might have been so entrenched at the time a bit better.
In one way, we're going to edge our way as part of the discussion to talking about how things are still resonating, still playing out now, now being sort of 2021. But I wonder if I can throw that way, your one that way, Liz. Like, it raised incredibly strong feelings, which led to civil war, so into violence. Is there some sense in which, yeah, that's all very reasonable, but the treaty was perceived as a sellout? Was it described as a sellout by certain factions? Was it seen as a sellout? And can you actually say, actually, it was in a way a sellout? Like it's all very reasonable, but that document sold the idea of the Republic, a united Ireland, and a certain vision of Ireland down the river, and that's why it just couldn't be accepted.
Yes, and I suppose you have the different elements that are like the different players, and Colin has mentioned that, you know, you've got the pro-treaty, you've got the IRA, we have the physical force movement and the political movement, and during the War of Independence, but the IRA came under the wing of the Dáil. So when they take the oath of allegiance to the Dáil, they are the army of the legitimately elected government. But they had been independent before that, and it is the IRA that, you know, that actually crossed that line into physical force with the attacks and so on. It wasn't sanctioned by the government. So you have that independent sort of streak, and certainly you have, like, with accounts of men when the treaty is signed and brought back, they feel like they have been sold out, that the politicians have actually let them down. And you have that breakaway, so there's that immediate mistrust that the politicians do not know, they have not got the idea, or they're not selling the idea of the Republic, they've given up on the idea of the Republic. But Collins and so on, maybe the exception of Arthur Griffith, because if you go back to his roots, dual monarchy was his philosophy. You know, that was his original idea, and his party Sinn Féin is really hijacked by the militants, thanks to the media after 1916, the British government. But Collins and those who do accept the treaty and who push on the pro-treaty side for this, we're as much Republican as the anti-treaty side, be them politicians or physical force activists, because when you look at it, both want to achieve the same goal, as in the Republic. It is just, we'll take different roads on how to get there. And you see in the, like, in councils across the country, when they're, because we have to remember this then, the politicians have to go to the people with this who have elected them in the 1921 election, and they have to listen to their constituents. And you have the likes of Sean Hales and so on from West Cork, his whole family, like, you know, went through so much, and he gets really insulted because he's not considered to be a Republican. But he stands up and says, don't dare any man not call me a Republican. I'm as Republican as those who are, you know, claim to be loyal to the Tourist County Republic, but my way is just a different way to get that. So the idea that they're chasing never disappears. You know, at that time, they're still chasing that goal of the Republic. It's just different ways on how to get there.
Great. I think going back to Colin, the play, as many of you will have seen, because you've seen this, has directed by Colin Morrison. There's a really fantastic cast, and there's some pretty strong personalities in that cast. You're looking at Karen Ardif as Arthur Griffith, for example. You're looking at Ali White, Birkenhead. Sorry, I'm looking for one name in particular. Playing De Valera is there. They are Jane Brennan. So I'm just making sure the name's right. So you got. I just want to just back off slightly and just go, you are collaborating with Colin Morrison and a cast who are bringing some pretty big thoughts into the room, or they can do if they choose to. How did you negotiate the tension between, these are my views, which I wish to adhere to in this play, and I actually wish to sort of acknowledge voices in the room which might be offering slightly different perspectives? How has that played out so far?
Oh yeah, I mean, Conall, this is my fourth play with Conall Morrison directing for Fishamble, and he runs a terrific room, and it's all about grappling with the core argument, so that everybody has ownership of, you know, not just their lines or their character, but actually their place in the argument as a whole. And so there's an awful lot of discussion about the context for lines, for scenes, for moments, and people are bringing their own reading to it and their own perspectives. And you know, I mean, I find it thrilling. You know, it's my favorite place to be. But really, what I'm trying to do is kind of step out of the way. You know, that sense of writer as mediator. I'm trying to plot a path through the historical material that is, you know, true to the characters and the stakes and the key events, and is not about what I think. about it, and the big the key process I think that we find that happens in rehearsals is where the cast come in and they help plot that path, because my first draft is never quite, or the draft I bring to rehearsals is never quite there, and that's partly because I'm bringing 2 months of chronological history and many sources, and I've found one path through it that I think is clear, and then as people start to unpick that, we realize actually that's not quite clear, or actually I've left something implicit there that needs to be explicit, or I've missed something that could be implicit, or so there's a real ethos of participation, I think, in terms of the cast putting it up to me to make sure that each moment in the play is delivering on all the levels of levels of character, the levels of action, of plot, but also of historical resonance.
Great. And one of the things you heard there, Liz, is that you'll have heard in the names of the actors that what we've got is a modern group of actors representing a more modern Irish society, playing roles that perhaps they wouldn't have played 10 years ago, and they certainly wouldn't have played 100 years, literally didn't play 100 years ago. So you've got women playing men and men in there, and you've got a varied cast. I just wonder, though, if you want to pick up on that, the maleness, I suppose, of the treaty negotiations, that there were women in and around the secretarial area and associated with the delegation and so on, but largely it was men, signing off and thing. How did that impact into, say, the women's movement coming on, I suppose, specifically, but the larger consequences within Irish history for women of this treaty, where you've got men in a room signing it off?
Yeah, and there were, like, at the time, there were women TDs, in the Dáil that had been elected, and women had proven themselves very capable of, organising and so on. And there was at one stage, a woman was considered to go as part of the delegation. It was Mary McSweeney, but that didn't happen. It's probably seen as she was too firebrand. She was the sister of Terence McSweeney. The Lord Mayor died in a hunger strike in Brixton Prison. But I definitely feel that certainly not having that representation there. But again, this was life at the time. There were no women on the opposing team, so it wasn't that it was a conscious decision made. It was actually really, when you think of it, that De Valera even considered sending a woman as part of the delegation. That's a moment there. But certainly when the treaty is brought back, pretty much immediately there is the split. But Cumann Amon, which was the women's organisation, they themselves are the first to have a convention on whether they should accept or reject the treaty. If we look at the Dáil itself, you have 6 women TDs, and I think most of them, if not all of them, opposed the treaty. Now there we have the mother of Patrick and William Pearse. We have Kathleen Clark, who not only lost her husband Tom and brother after 1916, but she herself, is a hugely important political agitator. Countess Markievicz, the first woman elected to the Dáil. You've got Kay O'Callaghan, whose husband was Lord Mayor of Limerick and being murdered just a few months earlier. The debates are heartbreaking, because you're literally seeing the relationships to be destroyed in front of your eyes. But the women are seen to be, they're blamed for or accused of rattling the bones of the dead, making these highly emotional speeches. But if you read the men's speeches, like Harry Boland, he calls the dead as much as the women do. And when you look at Mrs. Pearse, she's not just the mother of Patrick and William. She's every right to recall her dead or say that her sons would not have accepted this treaty. But in her own right, what she suffered after 1916 for her political activism, it's unbelievable. So she had that right to speak as well. But the men make as emotional speeches as the women. But the women are seen to be the diehards. They are the first to hold their convention. They overwhelmingly reject the treaty. The IRA hold their convention in March. And then you look at, of course, again, women are accused of making these highly, emotional speeches. But you look at the rallies that take place across the country. Arthur Griffiths is saying, if we're going to have civil war, let's have it. But not realising they're talking to people who have killed for the Republic before and will kill again. And you have that difference where the military men are trying to stop this, like Collins and so on, because they know if they cross that line, there is no going back. But in terms then of the legacy, the women, I think the treaty debates, a lot of antagonism stems from that moment against the women, especially against Mary McSweeney. The hatred that comes out against her is unbelievable. And the women become a real threat then, the Civil War. You have the mass arrests of the women. And what's really interesting is one positive thing to come out of the treaty was the fact that suffrage was granted to everyone over the age of 21. So we got the right to vote in Ireland. The women got the right to vote in Ireland, 6-7 years before they did in England. And there had to be an election on the treaty. The people had to go to the people. But women were under the age of 30 were not allowed to vote in that election in June. And there's all these conversations between Arthur Griffith pro-treaty, Shanti O'Kelly anti-treaty, where Shanti is saying, just change the register, get the women give them the right to vote. And Griffith is saying, it's not that I don't trust the women of Ireland, it will take too long to change the register. But Shanti comes back, they could do it in weeks after the First World War. You don't trust the women of Ireland. And by the way, the women are coming on voted on it. They've overwhelmingly rejected it. That is not the women of Ireland behind you. Now, it's interesting that then once the Civil War starts, you then have the amendments being made and the women can vote. Women over the age of 21 can vote in the election the following year. I don't know if it would have changed the outcome, but certainly it's a moment that was missed. And then you see then with the Free State government, we have 2 years of a moment as in terms of women, sort of the realization that we're equal. Some possibility of the proclamation is realized. Within 2 years, 1924, the Free State government began to chip away at the rights of women. De Valera gets blamed for, with the 1937 Constitution. However, the taking away of women's rights as equal citizens, it starts in 1924 with Kevin O'Higgins and W.T. Cosgrave. So, and I think a lot of it, the image of what an Irish woman should be was not the image of the revolutionary that was accepted, between 1916 and 1921, and even in the Civil War. That is all used against the women throughout the 1920s to find that ends up with the Constitution of 1937.
Great, you're absolutely touching on it there, and I'm just aware of time, so just picking up on what you're saying there, Liz, I'm just going to throw that concept away and then back to you again, Liz. In terms of, this is a play about events, you're very specific, December the 6th, 100 years ago, the signing of a certain document as part of a huge historical process. What are the things that for you are still resonating today? So we've touched on it there, the lives of women through Ireland in the last 100 years. You can see it changing because part of this, part of the revolution leading to Free State, all of that. So what are the things that for you make this document in a sense still alive, still having an impact on lives as they are lived now? If I come your way first, Colin, and I'll come back to you again, Liz.
Well, I mean, it was incredible writing this during Brexit, and particularly when Westminster was kind of in chaos, and they were having all those things they call the meaningful vote, and just the echoes in Brexit of the treaty, or for those of us who are sort of steeped in Brexit and maybe discovering the treaty anew, the echoes in the treaty of Brexit are kind of extraordinary. I suppose it points up that we never managed to resolve that question of border. And what the border is really about is about relationships, so relationships North and South, or nationalists and unionists, and relationships, Britain and Ireland, there's a moment in the play that's a moment that happened during the treaty negotiations when there's kind of a misunderstanding between Lloyd George and James Craig about midway through the negotiations, and Lloyd George is trying to persuade Craig.
Which one's Craig? Just the sake of
James Craig is the Prime Minister of Northern Ireland. Yeah. Partition has happened the previous year. And Lloyd George is trying to persuade Craig to bring his people, the Unionists, the state of Northern Ireland, within or under an All-Ireland Parliament. So a form of Irish unity, probably a kind of federated form of Irish unity. And whatever Craig says in the meeting, Lloyd George is left with the impression that Craig has agreed. And he has a weekend of effectively celebrating, thinking, yes, because if Craig is going to agree to join an All-Ireland Parliament of some form, then Griffith and Collins and the rest of the Irish will agree to stay within the empire, and the resolution will be amicable. And probably also, that's probably a deal that Griffith and Collins could have brought back to Dev, and the Dev would have signed off on. You know, Dev, he said he wanted the All-Ireland unity and a republic, but he was prepared to accept one or the other. So if they'd come back and said, if we have unity and we've had to concede on the republic, it probably would be okay. So in that moment where Lloyd George thinks Craig has agreed, opens up the possibility of a counterfactual Ireland where there's no civil war, and also there's no troubles, because there isn't an acrimonious legacy of partition to erupt in the 60s and 70s. And then that moment recedes. Craig comes back in, he turns hardline again, makes it absolutely clear he's not for turning. What we have, we hold. And that possibility of reconciliation between Unionists and Nationalists in late 21 disappears again, and the Civil War kills that off fully for, they think at the time at least a decade, and obviously it ends up being, a century and more. So that, it seems to me that the possibility that the treaty, when you revisit it and try to experience it as if it's happening, these negotiations are happening in real time and the outcome isn't predetermined, the possibility that they open up is the possibility of an Ireland that by 100 years later is not still divided, not merely by the border, but also in hearts and minds. And so that feels very resonant.
And Liz, if I was to come to you for one thing, and you're part of a larger process of a decade, looking historically across the decade of Centenaries, if there's one thing that really you feel now, and it really strikes you inside as we are actually living with this, this is now what we're living with, what would strike you from this period?
Well, it'd be two things, and it's exactly what Colin has said. It's that that partition in both physical and the emotional sense has not been resolved. There is no connection there. It's still two separate states. Although partition had come into effect the year before, I suppose by the Irish delegation signed the treaty, it cements it in from the Irish perspective. But so we are still, the country is still partitioned. There is still two states, and the conversations never happened. That we are Irish, we live in an island called Ireland. We're the same, to accept the differences. But then, of course, we have the legacy of the Civil War, which traumatized, like this whole country. We talk about Europe being traumatized after the First World War. Ireland had that, and then the added, the extra of a rising of the War of Independence, and then the worst conflict of all is the Civil War, where the country literally imploded, and it just wasn't talked about. And so we're not just dealing with the legacy of, it's those who took part, who made those decisions, but it's what happens to generations down the line. And this is why I really commend efforts like this. So through theatre, through performance, through song, to bring these stories to light so that people can actually access them. And it's, people, not everyone likes to read books. There's different ways to interpret history, tell the history. And something like this play, I know, will get people starting to question what has happened and to understand. It's not about judging. It's easy for us to judge 100 years later, but if we go back to that moment in time, which this play, we're going to see what it was like for these people 100 years ago in that moment, making a decision that would have, repercussions for generations. But to understand and try and be in their position, and maybe then we can start to deal with those issues, with the legacy of partition, with the legacy of the Civil War and so on, and understand it. Not say it's right or wrong, to understand it.
Great, that's great, Liz, and I think that's a very good place to take it to for the moment, because the play, you might see this before the play, during the play, and you will get a chance to see the play online and broadcast as well. So it merely remains me to say thank you very much for that great discussion, Liz and Colin. That's super stuff. I think that we can take the thing of say wishing Colin well with the preview and opening. So I hope that goes very well now. And to note, so this is Fishamble's production of The Treaty. And I can only encourage you to look for the Fishamble website for future Fishamble productions, along with sports and all the things that we do, and all the people who have made this play and production possible. Not possible to name them all, but they're there on the Fishamble website. Please do have a look. Thank you all very much, and goodbye.